Well, this House knows my views are quite different than that of some of my colleagues. But my colleagues accept my views just as much as I accept theirs. And that's what we're all about. We're a big tent party where everybody's given the capacity to express their views and their thoughts on what's going on. One of the guiding principles that I've adhered to all my life, particularly in my working life, but is to seek first to understand and then be understood. So after living the number of years that I have and being an outdoors person all my life as a trapper, as a hunter, fisher, camper, and I've seen the cumulative effects of forestry and resource development in my area, but right across the province. It's led me to spend a lot of time researching forestry and understanding what those cumulative effects were all about. And I know government's done a lot of work. I first went to government back in 2011 with my concerns over cumulative effects when I was a member of the BC Trappers Association. And I know they've developed the cumulative effects framework, and they've done significant work on that over the years. We've been harvesting wood in British Columbia now for well over 100 years. But it's ramped up this last 60 years because that's when we introduced clearcut logging to the province about 60 years ago. And the effects on biodiversity, our flora and fauna, I don't think is broadly understood by many in this House and by many folks across the province because they don't spend the time out in the wilderness like I have over the years. So the impacts of the 75 years of the sustainable yield strategy I spoke about before in this House that was adopted in 1945 is focused solely on growing and harvesting trees. Liquidating old growth, as one of the commissioners stated, I believe it was in the 1975 Royal Commission on Forestry. And we've transitioned now into managed forests, or working forests, industry terms it, of conifer plantations. So my task now is to be understood so that we as elected representatives in our communities have the big picture of a very complex natural environment that we all live in. And by recognizing all the collective values of our forests, not just the fiber, but all of the collective values, I think we can prevent, and I've told this in different groups I've spoken to, but I think we can prevent killing the goose that lays the golden egg in this province here. Like, we do have biodiversity that is second to none in British Columbia. One of my colleagues spoke earlier about, the British Columbia and what we have here. We have 94 million hectares. And British Columbia is the most ecologically diverse province in Canada. We've got 5 million hectares of wetlands, lakes, rivers, and streams. We have 36 million hectares of alpine meadows, mountains, rock, and barren ground, and the remainder is covered in vegetation. That's where the 50-odd million hectares comes from that I've heard referenced before. Of that, 22 million hectares is in the timber harvest land base. But the rest is a variation of different types of vegetation. Some of it is not harvestable. Some of it is uneconomical to harvest. Some of it that may be considered as old growth. And I've got lots on trapline that my family has north of Prince George. 3-inch diameter black spruce is considered old growth according to the definition. It's, I've got some in my office there. It's close to 150 years old, but it's 3 inches in diameter. That's considered old growth. There's hemlock. There's a variety of different conifer species in those higher elevations that are not economical to harvest. And they provide such a high level of biodiversity for a lot of the animals that we have. Mr. Speaker, I also have to emphasize that myself and my colleagues are in complete agreement that this legislation is ill-conceived. It's going to be detrimental to our rural communities, to our First Nations. And we've already heard a number of the issues that cause concern. But we differ on why we disagree. The bill is about reallocating timber, assigning tenure to First Nations and community forests. The bill, though, is still stuck in the rut of that incomplete strategy that I've referenced before, the Sustainable Yield Strategy from 1945. And it contemplates dragging these changes out over an agonizing time period, 10 years or more. But it's still only tinkering with the system. It's not taking into consideration all the other values on the land. But the question that jumped out at me when I read through this bill is what timber? So First Nations, have an opportunity. They'll be benefiting from this tenure reallocation. But I think when they get out there, they're going to be shocked to learn that the volume that is being promised to them isn't there. The volume of harvestable timber, and I have to emphasize the volume of harvestable timber. We have, our province is covered in trees. We have 22 million hectares of trees within the timber harvest land base. We've got millions of hectares that are outside of that have trees on them as well. But I'm talking about harvestable trees. When I talk about harvestable trees, I mean something that we can go in and cut down and we won't have to worry about the other values on the land if we do it properly. But if we go in and we harvest in cycles that will eliminate hundreds of species of wildlife, hundreds of species of flora and fauna in the province, I think we need to re-examine that position that we take on this. Up in my area, there's marten, there's fisher. We used to have an abundant population of them. Raptors like gray owls and the goshawks used to be in abundance up in that area. A lot of those animals, there's 65 species of wildlife in British Columbia that nest or den in tree cavities. And those tree cavities don't start developing until the trees are 70, 80, 100 years old. So in essence, by cycling through trees before they get to that, before they can accommodate this wildlife, we are effectively eliminating those 65 species of wildlife from British Columbia. I've got a report that I've had for years that I looked through. It was commissioned by the Forests and Lands back in the mid-1980s. And it was talking about the impacts of clearcut logging, because by that time we'd been clearcut logging for about 20 years in British Columbia. The impact of clearcut logging on marten and fisher, part of the mustelid family. And they were fine, the report 1986, but it had the Omineeka region of the province as one of the most densely populated, or having the most densely populated population of marten and fisher in the province. And they were all over the place at that particular time. And, but what they were saying about the clear-cut logging was that the temperature on the ground increased significantly enough that it was too warm for the marten. There was also not enough food sources for them if the clear-cut was too large. But the marten themselves den and have their young in the old-growth forest. And as that old growth was disappearing, the marten populations disappeared. And there's no count. The province doesn't do a very good job on inventory for wildlife across the province here. But, you know, you talk to any of the trappers that are out there and have been out on the land for 40 or 50 years, like I have, they can see that the marten populations are down probably by 90%. In many areas, the marten populations have been extirpated. In many areas, the fisher population has been extirpated. The Forest Practices Board did a review of marten habitat in the caribou a couple of years ago, and they had some recommendations to come out of it. But they were, you know, one of the things that they found was that all of the fisher habitat had been logged. It was gone, and that was the result of a lot of the pine beetle harvesting that we had at that particular time. And it will take probably a century before the habitat grows back sufficiently enough for the fish to return. We may end up having to do what the United States has done, and I participated in programs like that in British Columbia here years ago, where we will live trap animals like marten, like fisher, like lynx. That's happening right now. And they're transplanting them into areas that where they were extirpated down in the other parts of the province here. And I would hate to see us get to that particular point. You know, I mentioned raptors as a valuable part of the biodiversity population that we have throughout the province here. The interior, every night I could go out when I was out in the bush and I could hear owls all the time. I haven't heard an owl now for several years. But one of the other raptors that was predominant throughout the interior of the province was the northern goshawk. And beautiful bird with, you know, the plumage that the males had on them was a nice silvery blue color. And they were prolific all over the place. I haven't seen one now for probably 15 to 20 years. And there's an interesting study that was done recently up in the interior of the province. And they were looking at goshawks in particular. And in this particular forest timber supply area, they had determined that prior to existing industrial harvest, this area probably had 400 goshawk territories. And now they feel that it's down to 30 goshawk territories. And they call it territories because, and they say that you need 2,400 hectares of untouched forest around each of these goshawk territories in order to provide the environment for them to survive. And you know, they're down to 30 goshawks. Now, goshawks are like any other raptor, like any other animal in the wild, is they're very territorial and they fight to the death. If they lose their habitat, they fly into the next area that might sustain them, and there'll be a fight to the death, or the other one will get chased out, the weaker one, and could starve or you know, die of other causes. Same thing happens with fisher and marten. They will go into the adjacent area that might be able to sustain them, and they won't survive. The forestry's been going on for well over a century in British Columbia here. And I go back to comments that the Chief Forester made back in 2003 in a presentation to the UBC forestry students. And he was talking about the fact that up until the mid-1990s, forestry never took into consideration riparian areas, wildlife habitat. There are a number of things that they never looked at. They just looked at, we'll cut a tree down and it'll grow back in 100 years and we'll be able to cut it down again. And it wasn't until probably into the early 2000s before those factors were required to be looked at. And of course, they were put into the regulations on the Forest and Range Practices Act, Planning and Practices Regulations. But they were, like I mentioned in my previous discussion on the bill we had here a couple of weeks ago, it still didn't meet the requirements that were necessary to protect the wildlife that we have out there. We look at are salmon and steelhead in critical decline across the province. And I've recently read some hydrological reports that indicate that there's a number of factors with hydrological reports there, but I'll talk about the equivalent clear-cut area that we see, or that is used as a hydrological tool in the province. I think it was back in the 1990s, the province determined that if it's a community watershed, that only 20% of that watershed could be would be the equivalent clear-cut area. You could only have it 20% of it clear-cut. If it was a fishery-sensitive watershed, you could have 25%, and any other watershed would be 30%. And those were established, and they are still used today. There was a note that the Forest and Lands put out here back in 2017 that reinforced those numbers. And it's a complex formula. I've talked to hydrological experts in the last while, and it's a complex exercise they go through because of the terrain, the type of soil, the rocks, the growth. There's a number of factors that are taken into consideration. But those numbers still remain the same, 25%. Fishery-sensitive watersheds. If we look at the watersheds that have been where the steelhead spawn, as an example, and we see numbers declining, those watersheds have been clear-cut in excess of the 25% in these fishery-sensitive watersheds. Right from the confluence where they join another river or where they join a lake, all the way up to the source of that particular watershed. And like I said before, the Chilako watershed in my riding, and the member for Nechako Lakes, it's in his riding as well, has an equivalent clear-cut area of well over 80%. That was determined back in 1980. Used to have salmon counts well up into the thousands, and over the last 20 years or so, those numbers are now in single-digit numbers. And habitat, I walked a lot of that river here last summer with a fisheries biologist, and he was commenting on the importance of deciduous growth and the other parts of a natural environment along those streams here that would promote salmon habitat. We used to have moose populations in the interior guaranteed. If you're out hunting, the success rate was pretty high. Government documents show a sharp decline from 2005 to 2015, and another decline from 2015 up until I believe the record was around 2019. But the cumulative impacts of those moose population declines was somewhere up around 90%. There's a biologist working for government out of Prince George, made a presentation at the University of Northern BC, and he talked about the impacts of clear-cut logging on moose habitat and habitat for many of the other animals there. But what he was saying is that the protein value in the moose browse that were in these clear cuts, the further away from the edge of a mature forest that you got, the protein value declined to the point where a moose would have a full stomach of its favorite browse, but there was no food value in it. And they've done a moose collaring study up there, and they found all kinds of issues there. I won't go into all the details of it, but starvation was one of the critical factors there. And perhaps it led to predation, because predation was another major factor with the animals there. So those are the kind of issues that need to be kept in consideration moving forward with any kind of a forestry program. British Columbia can still have a viable forestry program, a viable forest sector. I've talked to, I know a lot of people in the forest sector. I worked in the forest sector as a young fella. I had relatives involved they had a logging outfit. And I still see people, you know, who work in the forest sector who own their own equipment. They are as concerned as I am about where these trees are. You know, I stop and talk to them out on the trap line when they're going by. You know, when you have a truck driver that has to go 200 or 300 kilometers into the forest to get a load of logs to haul back to town, that gets to be a long period of time.
Member, I think all the members understand the relationship to the bill, but for those that are watching from afar, could you every now and then tell us how that relates to the bill we're dealing with?
Yeah, yes, thanks for the reminder, Chair. This bill is about reallocating tenure. But there is more to, you know, when I talk about reallocating tenure, a lot of this has to do with that, landscape plans. There's a number of other things involved in that. But it is not, there is no mention in there about all these other values of the land that I've been speaking about for the last several minutes here. And so I think that needs to be a consideration that has to be injected into the process. Like I said, the First Nations and the communities that have community forests are going to be quite shocked when they go out there and look at what they have. And, you know, if they make a decision, and if the decision is made in this House that this moves ahead and we are going to be cutting down trees when they get to a certain age, without any consideration for the other biodiversity on the land, then so be it. But I want my voice to be heard saying that I think this is the wrong direction to go. I think that we should have a more ecologically based forest system, and we're not in government. I'm not in government. My job over the next few years is to bring everybody around to my way of thinking moving forward here, and we'll see what, you know, where we are by the time the next election rolls around here. But I think it's incumbent upon everybody, every elected person in this House, to go out and have a look and see what's out there. See how big these trees are, and see what wildlife habitat is left along the rivers and streams that we have in the province that provide the basis for our salmon and our steelhead and all fish species in the province here and bird species. The paradigm shift is required. And I've heard members talk about it in the House, and I've also talked about this with members that are involved in the forest sector. Mackenzie's in my area. There's been families that have worked in the forest sector in Mackenzie since Mackenzie was first developed in 1968. There's been families that have been involved in forestry and logging across this province for 4 generations and more. But we've been logging for 4 generations and more. But we have adopted technology and systems to log faster and to cut faster than we ever have before. And, you know, I don't want to see it end up like the Atlantic cod fishery where they got to shut everything down completely because there's nothing left to fish for. We have an opportunity here now to turn the dial and to bring in a forest policy, a different way of thinking than we had 75 years ago when we adopted the sustainable yield strategy. We need to change our thinking on this and come in with a strategy that recognizes all the values on the land base, where we recognize the flora and fauna and the interconnectivity that all of these species have in the environment that we have that contribute to clean water and clean air, that contribute to you know, reducing the forest fires, that contributes to just about everything that we stand for in British Columbia. We were once, like I said before, we were the envy of North America with the ecological diversity that we had here in British Columbia. I spoke to a wildlife biologist one time, and he was talking about how North America was anchored in 2 corners. One with Florida and all of the biodiversity they have down in Florida, and the other one is British Columbia. And I have to agree with him. The number of species that we have in British Columbia were second to none, you know, across North America. So, but we can still have that. We just have to adjust the dial, change our way of thinking so that we're inclusive of everything. And I hope the First Nations, when they look at this, take this into consideration as well. You know, I'm sure they want to see, you you know, the biodiversity maintained to a level that they can still go out and harvest their animals and their berries and their mushrooms and the things that we all live on. And I've lived on moose meat most of my life and wild harvest animals and whatnot. So this is something that I will talk about passionately. I think this bill goes in the wrong direction. I don't think I think it's still tinkering with the old sustainable yield strategy. It's an incomplete strategy because it only focuses on the fiber. It doesn't focus on all the values. And I think part of the problem that we have, this paradigm has become so cemented in the way we do things, it's become an ideology that we're fixated on and that's taught in our universities and our colleges. And we need people to start thinking in a completely different way. The future of British Columbia depends upon it. The future of British Columbia depends on the decision that's made in this House moving forward here on how we address forestry in future years, you know, for a century out. We can't look at 10 or 20 or 30 years out. We need to look at a century out. And I think if we do it the right way, we'll still have a forest industry. It's going to look completely different, but we're still going to have thousands of people employed in it. And we're still going to have people making a living off of it, but we're still going to also have people in adventure tourism, in wildlife management, people harvesting the protein off the land to feed their families. You know, there will be benefits for everybody if it's done the right way. Get out, have a look at it. If you can't get out and have a look at it, put it on your big screen TV at home and bring up that Google Earth Engine time lapse that I've talked about before that shows Landsat images from 1984 to 2020. And it'll show you the changes that have taken place over that period of time. And I think you'll be probably shocked at what you see when you go through that. So, Mr. Speaker, you know, I differ from, you know, I share the same outcome as my colleagues do with respect to the bill. I think it's wrong, but I got to that in a different way. So thanks very much for your time.